This week, we heard from the winner of Mr. Beast Games, Jeff, as he was on the Ice Coffee Hour podcast, where he ended up winning $10 million. Of course, be aware that this will have spoilers to the Mr. Beast Games show for those who may not have seen it on Amazon Prime, etc. The opening question, Ice Coffee Podcast, is mostly a finance show, so the first question, of course, came, which was, how much tax are you going to pay on the £10 million worth of earnings? And you may be wondering, where did the 10 million come from? Well, the 5 million was obviously from winning the show, and I believe there was also a coin flip where Mr. Beast also lost 5 million of his own money as well, hence totaling the total of $10 million won. And the answer really comes down on how Jeff is planning to use it. How much he's planning to give to his son's research, non-profits, etc. will likely bring that tax bill down. He also was likely, then they moved on to talk about the fact that why he was even joining the games or going to the games or wanting to be part of the games as a whole. It was lovely to hear, and he wanted to have a platform, by the sound of it, to discuss his son's really rare and unfortunate illness that we'll be going into a little bit more detail later, but he wanted to have that platform to talk about it and highlight it as well, as it's not commonly known, and wanted to give the illness and the research, of course, around it a lot more awareness. He was then asked what percentage he feels he would likely pay, and he believed that he didn't really want to necessarily do it for the money as a whole. And as I said, it was probably, so they pushed him on like what that tax bill would really end up being, and it sounded specifically like it'd be closer to half or 5 million, which is half of the overall winnings. Then the question did come, and this was because he was in California, and of course California's taxes are going to be higher, so it is something that they talked about. And then the question came is, did he really want to? So he's got lots of this money, of course, so he could have moved. He had all of the resources to move, and he chose not to, mostly because he didn't want to. He had a lot of the support networks, and he had a lot of the things for his children, and he seems to be a very child-centric, you could say, in respect to a person, so he didn't want to kind of upheave their lives and sort of have to sort or refix some of those challenges related to his son's illness as well. They were then led on to ask, would he, quote, have left his job after winning that much money? It turns out that Jeff had already been made redundant last April, so he was likely to kind of not be in work anyway. And this was kind of a commonality question, which was, how did people spend those 2 to 3 weeks filming Beast Games? Because they obviously had other commitments or prior commitments, and they couldn't necessarily just drop what they were doing. But it did sound like a percentage. It did sound like a percentage were entrepreneurial folk, or specifically ran small businesses and small business ventures, so they were able to sort of step out and step away to do more creative things. And this is also something that Jeff touches on quite a lot as well. He wanted to do some more creative stuff, and he was fortunate enough where one of his sons had got him introduced to Mr. Beast. So one of the byproducts of him being able to be on the show and actually winning the show is, of course, him being, quote, a cool dad, but also he was able to talk about his other son's rare disease called creative transport dysfunction. He was able to find the opportunity to be able to talk and get on the show by going for a casting agency, and he really wanted, and it seemed like when they were talking about how people got on to Beast Games, that Mr. Beast and his team maybe didn't go out of their way to make it really easy and really well publicized, so that those people who really wanted to be on the show specifically were, going to have to really find it out or really look into it a lot more in that respect. So it sounded like there was only really like an X post and maybe a LinkedIn post, and then it was posted on some casting boards as well. And Jeff had recently just reached out to a talent agency as well, because he had obviously just made this transition, because he unfortunately got made redundant, as I said earlier, in the previous April, and he was then wanting to move into more creative field. So he wanted to be part of commercials and act in commercials. sales. He also wanted to be in, some more startup or some more entrepreneurial side of things as well. So that's what he focused on, and that's what he was looking to do. And it sort of fell in his lap in that respect as well, because he then saw, obviously, Mr. Beast Games or Mr. Beast specifically and his team looking for people to join the Mr. Beast Games as a whole. And then, of course, they actually went into a bit more detail on the overall process of how people were then able to work with Mr. Beast Games and be part of Mr. Beast Games. And it started off as you have to send in a video explaining why you should be part of Mr. Beast Games and why it would be really useful for you or really helpful or really life-changing. And I think that was more around how you were going to use the money that you would obviously win, because obviously the final prize or the final overarching goal here is to win $5 million. So Jeff specifically, for whatever reason, didn't really necessarily go into detail on why he didn't make this high edited film, but it ended up working out for him. He ended up just doing a quick video on his webcam where his son ended up playing piano behind him, and it was a really cute touch. And I think the story producers who were choosing those people to take part, those first 2,000 from Beast Games, really, really liked that touch, and they ended up then going into some more level of due diligence, so checking his social media, checking for criminal records, etc. as well. So clearly that due diligence was specifically done, and of course Jeff then passed it, and then it moved further and closer to Mr. Beast Games filming. And after the social media checks and the criminal checks, there was obviously I guess you could call it a psychological and health check to make sure that every competitor was going to be psychologically sound enough to be able to go through this process, but also they were given access to a psychologist, a part of their exit process and exit interviews, every single contestant, and of course Jeff as well, to make sure they were psychologically going to be okay longer term, which is some of the details we found from this podcast, and also then a health test as well, because some of the tasks, as we know now, are or were specific, a lot of running, maybe lifting, some pulling, some heavy kind of physical exertion tasks. So it was really important that they weren't going to have any longer term health damage or potentially worse on set that could put Mr. Beast in more hot water than potentially he already was with the controversy that we covered at the time of filming of Mr. Beast Games. So then the question of Jeff's wife specifically came up, and when he specifically told her, and it was one of those things where he kind of explained kind of the kind of person she is, and she's the kind of person that's like, okay, so he's going to be away for 2 weeks, he's going to, who's going to take the kids to school, who's going to do this, who's going to do that, and she's very pragmatic in that respect. So he wanted to make sure that if he was going to actually be given this opportunity to be part of Beast Games, that it was more serious before telling his wife. And of course he was then going to be away for 2 weeks or more for the filming of the show. Then they started and talked about some of the other contestants that were taking part, and it was kind of this question that I alluded to at the beginning when I talked about the kind of people who were taking place or taking part in Beast Games. And there was a lot of conversation where some of them had like 2 weeks booked off for Beast Games. That was great, cool. But then they had to get really creative if it did go beyond a couple of weeks. And we hear a story from I think it was a lady or a female contestant that was working for an airline. And obviously they didn't mention the airline. And they were talking about the fact that she had to create some, because she got through to the Amazon Prime side of the show. And then that would have meant that she was actually away from work for 3 to 4 weeks and managed to keep her job as well. So she managed to be quite creative. He didn't go into too much detail on how creative she was, but she was specifically looking to be quite creative in that respect as well, on how she could get that extra time off and those excuses that potentially she made. And there was a kind of, I think in some ways they then go on to talk about the fact that none of the contestants had phones for like 5 weeks, and none of them had access to the internet for 5 weeks, especially Jeff as someone who was I guess you could say an advocate for keeping in the loop, keeping what's going on with the news, understanding what's current, etc. It was kind of interesting for him from a psychological perspective for him, but also from the other competitors as well, to see how, for the first couple of days, everyone's sort of going for their phone. But after that, then they were more open, and they were kind of in some ways would say free of that constant needing to check and needing to connect. And I guess in some ways some people would say they maybe had a better experience overall because they were able to have those depth connections where they were able to connect. But then of course that opens up a question which was around, okay, well, what happens if there's an emergency? How do we keep every competitor's family in the loop about how long they're going to be? Did they get through? Those kind of things. So it was really nice to hear from Jeff that the Mr. Beast team had that all kind of organised and was ready. So there was apparently a set of texts, and the family was kept in the loop about how Jeff was doing, and whether anything would happen. But of course, there was also places and a contact for the family to be able to contact the team for Mr. Beast team to be able to gain access to those contestants if they needed to. So, for example, if there was issues regarding, an emergency with, like, Jeff's kids, God forbid, or, like, his wife, etc., there would be ways to communicate with him during the games. But I think the whole point was, I guess, in some ways, for them to be more immersed in the games, but also to minimise or make it less likely that people are going to be able to leak sets, leak images, leak information, etc., that then could be picked up by press in that respect as well. Jeff did say and did explain that he did find it quite hard sometimes because he's used to talking to his mum and dad every day. And of course, when he didn't have his phone, that he wasn't able to do that. But as I said, there was ways to keep them kind of in communication, but kind of indirectly as well. He did also say that it was actually really amazing and it felt like the 90s because everyone was able to have those kind of more in-person conversations and those face-to-face meetings. And I've seen some posts today talking about there is, this kind of rise in face-to-face conversations and face-to-face meetings, especially in the creative field, because we are so digitally connected in that respect as well. Of course, then you can't have a podcast, unfortunately, without talking about the controversies as a whole. So they did then talk about, some of the, I guess, the lack of, I remember a quote being, I didn't expect if I'm going to compete for 5 million, then I don't expect to be it to be the Ritz-Carlton, in that respect. So I think there was at least from Jeff's understanding and Jeff's point of view, there was an understanding that it was going to be a bit of a slog, and it was maybe going to necessarily be a bit difficult when it came to the conditions, because you're competing for 5 million, and maybe people who were slightly softer would have had more of a complaint in that respect mentally. And I think it was an interesting conversation, and from his perspective at least, there wasn't, he didn't see the show runners or the show producers or anyone from Mr. Beast team deliberately go out of their way to I guess in some ways create those problems to be larger that we discussed about the lawsuit, for example. And I think it was one of those things where actually everyone was trying to do their best. And as I said in the show at the time, I think it's one of those things where as Mr. Beast hadn't done a production that size before and hadn't done something to that scale before, he didn't realize necessarily, how long does it take for 2,000 people to go to the bathroom before a show? How long does it take for 2,000 people to be fed 3 times a day? Part of it was also he wanted to film at night so he could control the light a lot better. What happens when you're maybe pushing people's circadian rhythm the wrong way around, right? So they're sleeping in the day or they're chilling in the day or etc. But then they're in a position where they're actually going to do that challenge overnight or doing that challenge during the night, as I say, to control that light as well. But it was kind of all what Jeff expected and, quote, what he was signing up for as a whole. And Jeff had, quote, no complaints from Vegas or Toronto, and definitely can see where people might have gone, gosh, you weren't used to the conditions. But for me, is exactly what I was expecting. And again, I think it goes back to what were people expecting necessarily from, or what expectations were set at the beginning in that respect as well. Then there was a couple of conversations and a couple of, talking points about, how is Jimmy? How is he as a person? How is he how does he come across as a human being? And there was a lot of conversation about how competitive he is all the time. And I think Jimmy, from what I've seen from the behind the scenes and people and what had been said about podcasts and etc., I think he did his best to talk to everyone. He did his best to see everyone and push and create the best experience he could for everyone. But the reality is when you've got got 2,000 people or 1,000 people, he was very open and very honest, and he said, look, it's unlikely I'm going to be able to spend a lot of time with all of you at this stage. But when it got down to, I think it was around, the 500 mark or even the 250 mark, then Jimmy was able to spend a bit more time and really get to know who these contestants were on a more deep level. And I know that there was some conversation where Jimmy really wanted to understand about Jeff's son's disease and kind of like how it affects his son, and where the research is and what potentially could happen. And it did seem, from at least what Jeff said, that he really did care, and he wasn't just playing lip service in that respect as well. And again, as I said earlier as well, there was a part of the show where everyone was given, as part of the exit process, access and sessions and access to a psychologist, because obviously you're building this massive thing up in that respect with the show, and with being part of the show and potentially winning all this life-changing money. And there's going to be a moment where you in theory crash and burn because you don't win it, you go out, you get eliminated. Even though you understood that was part of it, psychologically it was difficult. And even for Jeff, he found that actually there was this kind of euphoria moment when he won, and then it sort of came down, and then he had a bit of depression and was a bit sad, and then he sort of had it when the show came out again, really happy and etc. And he went through this emotional roller coaster, and of course not to the same level, but I can share kind of the same thing. And I think it's one of these psychological principles that come from when you build something up in your head. So for example, those who are new to the channel, welcome, but also those who have seen the show last week, I talked about the fact that we were going up to the photo and video show, and I was really building that up, and I found that really stressful the day before. When I was there, fine, adrenaline took over, and then I had like a good 12 hours or so after the show back when all the content was out on like the Monday midweek this week, and it was one of those things where I felt sort of, I wouldn't go as far as down, but I definitely had like pre-conference blues in that respect. So I can only imagine what being on Beast Games and coming down from Beast Games would have been like in that respect as well. Then they talked in a little bit more detail about the game strategy as a whole that Jeff was playing, or that he would suggest for people who are taking part or potentially going to be taking part in Series 2, Series 3 and potentially Series 4, that Jeff felt that was likely Mr. Beast would do about how you could play the game, right? And some people were playing with a bit more, I guess you could say, lackluster in regards to their morals, because they were just there to play a game. There's a good couple of examples where I think it was 4 people could have stolen $1 million from their team and walked away with that $1 million specifically, but they didn't. So they were playing the strategy within their own values. There was like others that maybe had played underhand, and then it kind of got out and ended up biting them in the long term as well. So it really depends, I think, and what Jeff sort of talks about in this episode as well, is you need to, in most cases, play along lines with your own values and with your own thoughts on how you want to play the game. But also, I don't think you should necessarily go beyond or go against the overarching or the what you feel is morally okay and not. You should be honest, and there is obviously some heated conversations that happen, but it's about how do you, I guess, build a relationship to potentially be in a position where and also just understand that some people are there it's a game, right? To play the game. And that came through in the podcast and the part of the conversation as well. So that's what they led on to. Then the conversation obviously stepped into, in some cases you'll want to be a leader, in other cases you'll want to be more of a follower, and kind of having that shift and that conversation back and forward with what you were doing, but also as a whole to making sure you could shift balance. Because in some games Jeff tried to be a leadership role and tried to kind of step up and lead a team or lead a group. In other cases he was trying to be a little bit less and not give the attention on him. And that's kind of where it then led on to, is it more about skill or is it about luck? And I think like a lot of things, I think it's a mix. I think, and Jeff articulated this quite well, he had a lot of lucky events that took place, a lot of lucky things that happened, but he also needed to be in a position where he could also play strategically, right? He could make sure that he knew what was going on. He knew kind of the chess moves ahead, maybe to play against other players within the games. But then also, of course, he needed to win a role, or he needed to. There's lots of examples where he quote got lucky as well. So he really thought it was a mix in that respect. They then obviously asked him about one of the most challenging moments within the show, and he talked about the fact that he was put in a box with three people he was very close with, one specifically, and they basically had to choose or find a game, and there was a phone and you could have asked for anything, and he was in a position where basically if you had, I think it was 5 hours, if I recall correctly, and you had to choose or come up with a game to allow two people to be removed from the Beast Games as a whole, and then one person would move forward. And it turned out that they tried doing a 3-way kind of roll dice kind of game, highest number wins, but one of the players was just being very stubborn in respect to he wasn't going to self-eliminate in that respect, and if no one self-eliminated in the box, then everyone within the box would be eliminated. So what ended up happening was Jeff and his best friend at the time, or one of the people he was very close with within the games, ended up doing a coin flip that Jeff obviously won, and that he found really hard, and that hit him quite a lot, and I think a little bit more than he expected as well. And then they alluded back going into kind of the game mentality or the human nature question around, will people be genuine when they're playing for $1 million, 5 million, 10 million, whatever the prize pool ends up being for next series? And I think it's one of those things where certain people will just emulate, and I think all of it will just emulate who they are as a whole, right? So if you're very, what you could call honor driven or trust driven, or etc., then you'll be more that way. If you might be like, hey, look, it's a game, this is what it is, we're going to play the game, then you'll play the game a little bit more in that respect. So that's something to keep in mind specifically. And that's everything that we covered in the first hour. I'm going to just cut down on time. I'm going to be covering the second hour of this podcast in next week's episode, but I will link it down below if you're interested. And if you'd like I'd love to hear what you think on my thoughts, my input from this kind of drop down, or this kind of commentary side of that as well.